So recently, the wizards over at Night Dive Studios spoiled us again with another amazing port, this time of Quake 2. But as I sat down and blasted through both Platinum trophies for the PS4 and PS5 versions, and then jumped onto the PC version to play through it again, a single question rose to the surface of my mind, and strangely, it wasn't anything to do with Quake 2, but instead, it was about another game in the series. We all know the story by now. Quake 1 is its own thing, separate in every way from Quake 2, and only sharing its title, with a new world, new enemies, along with a greater focus on story. 2 years after Quake 2's 1997 launch in 1999, Quake 3 Arena would veer back towards the original, but this time in the most extreme sense, with absolutely no single player of any kind being included, and the game essentially just being a multiplayer only experience. But while it looked like Quake might never tell another story again, in 2005, 6 years after Quake 3, we got what would be the most complete, coherent, and cinematic single-player experience the franchise has ever produced to date. And it was that game that kept coming back to me as I toiled through Night Dive's incredible new port. So let's put aside the reverence for the classic entries that we already know are fantastic, and take a little bit of time to talk about Quake IV, and what it's like to replay it 18 years after it launched. Quake IV was first released at the end of 2005 for both PC and as a launch title for the then brand new Xbox 360. In an ironic turn of events, it was developed by Raven Software in collaboration with id and published by Activision. So, just to get this straight, Raven, who were purchased by Activision in 1997, were hired by id Software to make a new Quake game that would obviously also be published by Activision, and it would be marketed heavily as a release title for Microsoft's new console. Years later, id Software would be bought out by Bethesda, who are now owned by Microsoft, who are also trying to buy Activision. So then, that would mean that they own Raven Software, but they already own id, who own Quake. What? Anyway, if you've never heard of Raven Software before, they were low-key one of the best developers around for a while, making games like Hexen, Heretic, Soldier of Fortune, Star Trek Elite Force, Star Wars Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast, Wolfenstein 2009, and criminally underrated shooter Singularity. Unfortunately, in recent years, they seem to be tasked with primarily making multiplayer maps for Call of Duty games, and while I don't even know how many of the original developers are left there now, I'd really like to see them tackle some other projects and IPs again, because it kind of feels like they're being wasted at this point. Anyway, Quake IV is positioned as a direct sequel to Quake 2, and takes place right after its ending, even referencing its events in the first few minutes.
Gentlemen, good news in the war against Strogg. A lone Marine battled through enemy lines and killed the Strogg's leader, the Macron. He's also disabled the Strogg planetary defense guns.
With the planetary defense systems down, and the Macron killed, humanity is leading its second invasion of the planet Strogos, the alien homeworld of their new greatest enemy, with the hopes of defeating them for good and finally putting an end to the war. Now, normally I'm quite spoiler conscious with my videos, either leaving them out or at least giving you a time skip option, but that's kinda not possible here, as what happens in Quake 4's story feeds directly into gameplay and vice versa. With that in mind, there will be spoilers for Quake 2 and Quake 4 from this point. Oh, and also, I'll only basically be talking about the single player campaign, as I never really played much of the multiplayer back in the day like I did with the other Quake games, and also trying to get a match now seems almost impossible. But I guess what I mean is, if you haven't played this game yet, feel free to pause this video and go and put 5 to 7 hours into Quake 4, and maybe also do the same for Quake 2, and then come back and hang out with the rest of us cool kids. So, it's a short time after Quake 2's protagonist, the enigmatic Bitterman, has finished his campaign of carnage across Strogos, and humanity's forces have judged now the best moment to strike. The player takes control of Matthew Kane, a silent and mysterious protagonist that seems to occupy a mildly legendary status amongst his fellow Marines, most of whom seem to speak of him as some sort of boogeyman, famous for surviving impossible odds and laying waste to the enemy no matter the situation.
Who's the new guy?
Matthew Kane. One certified badass.
Now, while this might seem initially like the usual machismo, silent protagonist the genre can be known for, Quake IV actually has something more interesting in mind, but we'll get to that in a bit. As the team approach the Strogg homeworld, their ship is shot down, and Kane is separated from the rest of his comrades, a group known as Rhino Squad. After relocating and reconvening with Rhino Squad, Kane and his fellow Marines begin an insurgent assault on certain targets on the planet's surface, such as aircraft hangars and the Strogg defense systems. After destroying or taking control of these targets, the team eventually rendezvous with the USS Hannibal, a command ship coordinating operations on the surface. On board, Kane is again revered by the other Marines as he makes his way to the briefing room for information on the next mission. Also, if you look around the ship on your way, there's some interesting world building here in the form of conversations between other Marines and whatever tests are going on in the medical bay. You see, it seems that while it was initially thought during the events of Quake II that the Strogg were after our natural resources, it seems that they were instead actually after our natural resources, as in our actual biological matter, leading to the revelation that they've been using humans in strange ways to power their technology and even bolster their forces. But more on that in a little bit. After arriving in the briefing room, Rhino team is given the details of their new assignment. They're to infiltrate the Strogg Central Communications Hub and set off an electromagnetic pulse at its centre, taking out something called the Tetranode, which will hopefully throw the Strogg's hive mind, a mysterious system or entity known as the Nexus, into complete disarray. It seems Kane's job is to protect the convoy and see it safely to its location in order to set off the EMP device. But of course, things go sideways almost immediately, and the group get absolutely murked on their way by a Strogg ambush. Oh yeah, and the EMP also gets damaged and triggered early. With the plan in tatters, Kane regroups with the only two members of the squad that seem to still be around at this point, Private Johann Strauss and Lance Corporal Nikolai Sledge Slidonovich. Strauss figures out the three of them can actually still take out the Tetranode by sabotaging its cooling systems. However, after splitting up again, Kane reaches the entrance to the Tetranode alone and is met first by two rocket-equipped network guardians, and then is attacked by the re-emerged chief villain of Quake II, the Macron, rebuilt and more lethal than ever. Needless to say, he gets pretty messed up. However, it's here where Quake IV really takes an awesome and unexpected turn, subverting expectations and switching things up in kind of crazy ways. You see, while you might think that the Strogg would kill Kane, or perhaps he fights his way out at the last minute, instead, well... Yep, that's right. You're a Strogg now. So can we take a second to talk about how crazy and awesome this twist is? The whole game up until this point has been painting Kane as an unstoppable, infallible killing machine, destined not to be stopped by any alien scum. But then all of a sudden, it's like, nah, actually, he's been caught, and oh yeah, we're going to cut his legs off, stab him with a massive spike in the heart and the head, and then turn him into some sort of David Cronenberg Robocop. The first time I played this, I honestly never saw this coming. And even knowing the twist now, watching it play out is still really awesome, and an interesting direction to take the story in for sure. Anyway, before Kane's final Strogg neurochip, a device that will connect him to the hive mind and make him subservient to the Strogg cause, can be activated, Rhino Squad bursts in and saves him, choosing to let him live given his status as their squad mate and his possible use in the ongoing fight against the Strogg menace. Shortly after this, the head of Rhino Squad, Lieutenant Voss, is attacked and presumably falls to his death after being caught by probably the most obvious ambush ever experienced by a person in the history of existence.
But you've really gone above and beyond. When we heard you and Strauss were missing at the hub, we assumed you'd been killed. With sheer luck, we found you in the medical labs.
Look out! Continuing on, Kane makes his way through the medical facility and onto waste disposal, and it's here where we get a real good close-up look at the nasty, weird shit that the Strogg have been doing to humans whenever they get hold of them. Seriously, man, look at this. What the fuck? Battling through bunches of zombies and more than a few disgusting locations, the player eventually runs back into Lieutenant Voss again. Turns out he didn't die, but now he's a little bit different.
Kane! You have to get out of here! I don't know how much longer I can last!
What the fuck is that?
After defeating him, Kane and the remaining members of Rhino Squad make it back to the Hannibal, where Kane is met with caution at best and outright disgust at worst.
Maybe HQ would let us run some tests on it.
Excellent idea. Let's find out.
As an aside, it's so interesting just how many of these guys respected you the last time you were here, and now they fear you, hate you, gossip about you, or want absolutely nothing to do with you. Hell, even the higher-ups have their doubts. Luckily though, all those doubts fall by the wayside when they realise that Kane's new physiology might just be the key to gaining access to the Nexus core and taking it down for good. So, with some familiar characters in tow, Kane then drops right into the main Strogg stronghold and fights his way up 3 towers in order to realign the structure data nodes and activate a teleporter that leads directly to the Nexus. Along the way, he meets the new Macron again, but this time messes it right up, before going on to deal with a few more unsavoury characters that all need taking care of along the way. Finally, after activating the teleporter and killing the Strogg guarding it, the core is revealed to be a brain? Like literally a massive brain. What ensues is a relatively easy boss fight and victory for Rhino Squad. In the final moments, we get a cliffhanger ending, setting up DLC that would never be released as it was cancelled halfway through development. So that's shit. So that's the story of Quake IV, and what a crazy ride it is. But I think I know what you're thinking. I said earlier that spoilers were kind of necessary when talking about this game, as they tie directly into gameplay. So let me explain why. Right from the start of the game, Quake IV feels different from the other entries in the series. While Quake as a franchise has always been fast-paced and balls-to-the-wall movement-driven action, Quake IV is much slower and much more atmospheric, clearly keeping elements from the original titles, but also attempting to make the experience a little less about gameplay and more about every element of the game's design working in unison. Sure, the gameplay plays a big part, but Quake IV is also about the visuals and the atmosphere and the story and the design. But while all of this might feel like too much of a diversion in its opening hours, Quake IV actually knows exactly what it's doing. You see, when you get turned into a Strogg, at that point around a third of the way through, your speed and health immediately increase, bringing the game much more in line with the other series' entries. Now, to be clear, movement is never as quick as in the other Quake games, and Quake IV still maintains a slower and more considered pace, even after this point. But despite this, it never doesn't feel like Quake, and this is especially the case after the Strogg upgrade. Stuff like circle strafing and adding jumping into your game feels much more natural, and the quicker movement alters every part of the experience for the better. Now, I know there are some out there that will be saying that this faster speed should have been there from the start, and I get that point of view. For me though, I sort of love that they hold it back a while, both to make you appreciate it when it arrives, and also to use it as a gameplay device to help drive home what's happening in the game's story. Also, love it or hate it, it's clear that this was an intentional choice by the developers, with loads of clear setup and reference points being established earlier in the game, before the twist even occurs. Stuff like some of the conversations in the medical bay on the Hannibal during your first visit, some of the marine dialogue, or the Strogg health stations being present with no explanation earlier on in the game. All of it's there as signposting, sort of setting up what's going to happen before it does. But more than all of that, I just kind of love that the game isn't afraid to show how brutal this enemy is, and how vulnerable you are as a single human trying to take it on, even if it ultimately doesn't do anything with that idea, and kind of undermines it by having you defeat the hive mind basically single-handedly at the end, without even so much as a scratch. Also, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the game plays badly before the twist, and for me, Quake IV is a blast all the way through, even before your speed is upgraded. And a lot of this is due to the game's feel, responsive controls, great sound, and of course, its roster of awesome weapons. So, players start off with a blaster, a small pistol with unlimited ammo, which might as well be called the wet fart thrower. Actually no, I think my wet farts would actually do more damage than this fucking thing. Luckily, not too far into the game, this piece of absolute crap is rendered useless by the machine gun, and let me tell you, this thing is low-key a beast.
Fuck you!
Firing full auto from the hip or semi-auto when aiming down the scope, I was still using this gun regularly in the final hours of the game during my recent playthrough, and I actually found it more powerful and useful than some of the later weapons. I mean, it's just that good. Next, you get the shotgun, and while there is unfortunately no super variant in Quake IV, this thing still packs a punch, especially from short range, and it's honestly one of my favourite weapons in the game.
Shut up!
The next two weapons you get are the Hyper Blaster and the Grenade Launcher, and both of these are sort of a mixed bag, with the Hyper Blaster being by far the best of the two. It's sort of like an energy variant of the machine gun, but less accurate with a much higher rate of fire. And while this thing can absolutely rip enemies a new arsehole at the right range, it burns through ammo faster than I burn through Imodium after a can of Red Bull. The Grenade Launcher, on the other hand, is something else entirely. While it does do decent damage, it's a little bit unwieldy and has a strangely low parabolic arc, which makes it hard to hit enemies past a certain distance. Next up, you get the Nail Gun, and while cool and satisfying to use, I kind of found this thing to be a little bit inconsistent at times. Like, an enemy would take a whole clip to take down sometimes, but then I'd fight another of the same enemy type a little bit later, and it would kill them almost instantly. A little bit further into the game, you get the Rocket Launcher, which is super useful for bosses, but is less advisable to use often in any other situation. This is because the few bosses that you fight in Quake IV tend to be in open areas, whereas much of the rest of the game takes place in narrower spaces and corridors, and this means it's super easy to kill yourself with this thing if you're not being careful. Finally, the last three guns you get are the Railgun, the Lightning Gun, and the Dark Matter Gun. The Railgun is similar to its Quake II counterpart, although it has been nerfed a little bit, despite now having a scope. And the Lightning Gun looks great and gives me Return to Castle Wolfenstein vibes, which are always welcome, but it's actually relatively weak compared to the rest of your arsenal. Finally, the Dark Matter Gun is Quake IV's answer to the BFG, but it does kind of pale in comparison, to be honest. Firing out mini black holes that float through terrain and can even suck enemies in, it can do a lot of damage in the right situations, but it is also wildly inconsistent. During the final boss fight, I started off trying to use this thing and ended up just changing to other weapons because it was so unreliable. Having said that though, there are certain bosses it absolutely annihilates. Disgusting. Several of these weapons also get upgraded throughout the campaign, and some of them really benefit from it. For example, the Nail Gun gets an upgrade for extra damage, and then later on another upgrade which allows you to lock onto targets, complete with heat-seeking bullets. But the real strength of this arsenal is that it's balanced, and no single weapon is too overpowered or significantly better than the others. While I guess there were a few omissions from previous Quake games, their absence is never felt too strongly here, because there's almost always something fun to use to take on the Strogg forces. Also, as was the norm at the time when this game was released, there are a bunch of vehicle and on-rails turret sections that really serve to break up the pacing in a beneficial way, and are also handled with some nice setup and payoff. Like, when you first get on board the Hannibal, you'll see these walkers in the maintenance bay, only to pilot one later on in the campaign. This is just one example, and there's tons of this all the way through. But while all of this stuff is awesome, there are unfortunately still a few things to moan about, even if it's nothing too egregious. Firstly, I found the difficulty to be a little bit inconsistent, both when fighting my way through certain stages, but even more so with the boss fights. Like, the only boss fight I died on in my entire playthrough was the Strogged up Lieutenant Voss, despite him being maybe the first proper boss in the entire game. All the others I absolutely murked without even breaking a sweat. I also sometimes found I'd enter an area and take a lot of damage very quickly, only to reload my quick save or enter the next area with the same enemy types and destroy everything without dropping a single health point, despite not really feeling like I was doing anything different. But to be fair, these issues occurred infrequently, and for the most part, Quake IV plays like a slightly more considered version of its predecessors, which is absolutely fine by me. However, what's not fine, and stands as one of the biggest objective criticisms of this game, even if it doesn't bother you too often, is your character's fall damage, which is absolutely fucking ridiculous. Seriously, look at what happens when I drop off this ledge, which, by the way, I'm supposed to do to progress. Like, it's literally about 8 feet high. Why am I taking this much damage? Also, bear in mind this is after I've become a Strogg, with fucking robot legs. Finally, there's some weird backtracking here and there that's laced within the game's objectives, and occasionally you'll be tasked with traversing the same few corridors you just went through. It's not particularly egregious, and it seems to occur a little less in the game's second half, but it's just a bit weird and unnecessary. Speaking of objectives, I should probably mention the game's friendly AI. Throughout certain sections of the game, you'll have a few squad mates with you, and these guys can actually be quite useful, taking out enemies and replenishing both your armor and health sometimes as you need it. Also, other than some of the aforementioned bosses, I found that the enemies were mostly pretty threatening and acted in ways I'd expect, with only a few outlying moments here and there when the AI seemed to get confused. When it comes to presentation, Quake IV has aged like a fine wine. That is to say, very fucking well. I have a bit of a soft spot and a lot of nostalgia for this era of shooters. You know what I mean, basically between about 2004 and 2010-ish, when we got games like Fear, Half-Life 2, Bioshock, condemned Criminal Origins and Doom 3, among many others, and companies were still making strong single-player experiences without microtransactions or nerfed difficulty papered over with cinematic on-rails gameplay. When it comes to this period, I also just love the aesthetics, and most of the games I'm talking about have that indefinable look that really encapsulates the era. Also, speaking of Doom 3, it's very clear that Quake IV was made in the same engine, with it sharing a very, very similar vibe. But like Doom 3, the lighting and use of shadows here is what makes it stand apart, creating genuinely incredible atmosphere and helping the game still look great even in 2023. Separate from all of this stuff though, I think it's clear that Quake IV was going for a much more cinematic presentation, and I can see a lot of influence here from some of the best science fiction movies of the late 80s and early 90s. This sequence here, as well as some others for example, reminded me a lot of James Cameron's Aliens, and when you're being turned into a Strogg and then later operated on back on the Hannibal, it just kind of reminded me of David Cronenberg and Paul Verhoeven movies, like RoboCop. I mean, just look at the design for your character after he gets turned into a Strogg, and compare that to Murphy when he takes his helmet off. When it comes to music, Quake IV is again a divergence from its predecessors, with a much bigger focus on cinematic and ambient score, and a lot less on metal and rock music, which was seen in the previous entries. Having said this though, I think it kind of works and is much more in keeping with the tone they were going for here. When it comes to sound design though, this game absolutely slaps, and some of the guns just sound awesome. Along with the impact of the bullets and the feel of the gameplay, this stuff really just makes the whole experience more visceral and satisfying. The voice acting is a bit of a mixed bag here, and much like the character models in Doom 3, everyone looks a bit weird. Some of the animations can also feel a bit off at times, and the skyboxes on some of the outdoor areas have aged a little bit, and they look notedly worse than the interiors. Even so, I remember these things standing out when put up against the game's environments, which upstaged them quite badly even in 2005. The enemies on the other hand fare much better, with both new and updated entries filling out a varied rogues gallery of foes, and all of them looking decidedly disgusting and threatening in equal measure. Having said that though, I do think a few of the larger creatures look a little underdeveloped, with a lot of them kind of looking like failed ideas from Doom 3, or just amorphous blobs, but there's only 3 or 4 of these in the entire game I guess. Taken all together, what we have here is an underrated entry in the Quake series, and also an often overlooked first-person shooter in general. While its focus on a more cinematic story and a slower pace was always going to alienate some fans, personally, I think Quake IV has more to offer than some other entries in the series. It's a fun, great-looking, interesting first-person shooter that respects your time whilst moving at an intentionally slightly slower pace. It's never afraid to make you wait or throw you off, and the way it uses subtle setup and payoff in almost all of its elements is something rarely seen in this genre. From the way that people treat you before and after the twist, to the subtle changes in the UI and the other elements after this part of the story, it all just reinforces the game's narrative and makes it super fun to replay. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is the best story ever told in gaming or anything. It's not even the best story told in a first-person shooter by a long way. It shies away from delving into its potential themes and cops out by the end by falling back into the usual your character saves the world trope, which again, I think was always the intention. But nonetheless, despite its lack of depth, it is still the best story told in the Quake franchise by a mile, and is also a fun ride from start to finish. But before we wrap this thing up, I suppose we should talk a little bit about how this game runs and also what it's like trying to play it in 2023. Unfortunately, back in 2005 when this game first released, the push to market it primarily as a console exclusive ended up hurting Quake IV, as that version runs terribly, with bad performance like sub 25 FPS at best, awful screen tearing, and really long load times. While it would get a re-release on 360 after Bethesda purchased id Software in 2009, and generally the console version is probably best avoided, especially seeing as how it was never made backwards compatible on the newer Xbox models. But the good news is, this game seems to run perfectly fine on both Steam and GOG, and also runs fine on Game Pass for PC, with support for higher resolutions seemingly in all versions, and even some mods out there to refine the experience, should you wish to seek them out. The footage in this review is from the Game Pass version, which is also free if you've got a subscription, by the way, and I experienced no bugs or glitches in my entire playthrough. So if you have about 5 to 7 hours to spare and you want to play an awesome first-person shooter from a sorely missed and bygone era, or if you love Quake but you missed out on this entry, or bounced off it back in 2005 because maybe you played the terrible Xbox 360 version or something, then I'd strongly recommend giving it a go as soon as you can. While it's not perfect, I think it deserves its place among its siblings, and it also continues to stand as one of the most underrated shooters ever made. Also, while rumours have been in and out of the gaming zeitgeist about a new Quake reboot that compares to projects like Doom 2016 or Machine Games' Wolfenstein titles, nothing has yet materialised. And I don't know about you, but I don't give much of a shit about Quake Champions. I guess what I'm saying is, I've always been a single player first kind of gamer, and Quake IV does the concept of a single player focused campaign in this universe justice, expanding the lore, crafting a fun story, and delivering some awesome, visceral gameplay. Now all we need is those wizards over at Night Dive to remaster this one, and we're golden, right?